Really appreciate you all coming today and the opportunity to come here and present. It's always nice to be close to home, and I feel like I feel a deeper connection to the crowds and the people and the place. And it's this city itself is a lot like places I'm familiar with and comfortable with and kind of intuitively grew up with and know. So thank you for that. Just real briefly, our mission as a 501c3 is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. Strong Towns began as a blog. Today we're a full media site. We do 2-3 new articles a day. We have 3 different podcast streams. We do videos frequently. We go around and do events like these around the country. Our whole approach is designed to share a set of ideas and understanding so we can change our common cultural understanding about growth and development. The book came out October 1st. It's now available. You can get it anywhere. We love to partner with local bookstores, and we found a really great one here. And so if you're so inclined, I would recommend you frequent the local bookstore here, and they can get you a copy. I like to start the conversation the way I end chapter 3 of the book, and that is talking about Detroit. As I've traveled around the country, I found that everybody has an explanation for what happened in Detroit. That explanation is always consistent with one's worldview. It is mostly coherent. It is a plausible explanation. But everybody's explanation seems to be just a little bit different. The only thing that all these explanations have in common is one point that everyone generally is insistent upon. That point is, we are not Detroit. Our city, the place I live, bears no resemblance to what happened in Detroit. I'm going to give you the Strong Towns narrative of Detroit. And it begins back in the early 1900s, before Henry Ford, before the automobile. Detroit was one of the wealthiest cities, not just in North America, but in the entire world. This was a place of such richness and opulence. You can go there today and still see places like the Detroit Opera House, which would be at home in any of the great capitals of Europe, even now, despite decades of decline and disinvestment. When Henry Ford began to build the automobile and Detroit was on its way to becoming the Motor City, they were the first place to experiment with what would become known as the North American development pattern. They were the first ones to set up commuter suburbs around the edge. They were the first ones to have the expectation that people would live out there on the edge and drive into the middle of the city for work, return at the end of the day. They were the first ones to run highways through the neighborhoods, tear down buildings for parking lots in order to make that happen. And when this country hit the Great Depression and cities started to go into bankruptcy, experience massive economic distress and dislocation, there was one city and some satellites around it that kind of shared in its economic fate that comparatively did very well. That, of course, being Detroit. Detroit continued to grow, continued to have a modicum of prosperity. And so by the time we finished the Depression and World War II, and we were having a conversation about what comes next, it was very clear to local leaders across the continent, mayors and city council members, local professionals, what needed to happen if we were going to create a prosperous country. What needed to happen is they needed to copy the development pattern pioneered by our most successful city. They needed to copy what Detroit did. And that's what they did. Detroit's not some crazy, weird place. It's not some place unlike any of our cities. Detroit's just a couple decades early. They're just ahead of everybody else. My mom got an advance copy of the book, and when she finished chapter 3, she called me up and said, "Chuck, this is very depressing." I said, hang with it, Mom, it gets better. I'll give you a testimonial from my mom that it does get better. She agrees. But it's important to start with Detroit, because what Detroit did, and ultimately the struggles that Detroit has now, is because they changed their city from being one of complexity to one that was merely complicated. They changed their city from a complex adaptive system to one that functioned more like a complicated machine. When we think about complex adaptive systems, we most frequently think about natural ecosystems, something like the rainforest, with an immense amount of diversity. When we look at the rainforest, we understand that each component of the rainforest, if we were to walk through it or travel through it, is going to have a lot of diversity. Things are going to change and be different from place to place. All these individual parts and components interact with each other. The structure of it emerges out of these interactions. There's no way to go out and build rainforests. There's no way to go out and essentially plant rainforests. In fact, when we've torn rainforests down, what grows back? Weeds. Rainforest itself, as a complex adaptive system, has an emergent order to it. The order emerges out of the complex interactions of all these individual parts and components. This is the same kind of thing we see in traditional human habitat. Human habitat, the places that we built for ourselves, evolved and adapted to us over thousands and thousands of years of trial and error experimentation. Humans on different continents, on different latitudes, in different cultures, came up with building styles and approaches that fit our needs as humans. The ideas that worked, they kept and expanded on. The ones that didn't, those became, in a sense, evolutionary dead ends. And what we see over time is this complex adaptive environment with an emergent set of understandings of how to build successful human habitat. Systems that are complex are very different than ones that are merely complicated. A Rube Goldberg machine is incredibly complicated. It takes a very smart person to put one of these together, or a team of very smart people to put one together. But we understand that if you cut one of the strings in a Rube Goldberg machine, or you move one of the balls or the joints in one place or another, it doesn't evolve and adapt. A new order won't emerge. The machine simply breaks. It simply stops working. If you think of your automobile engine, if your automobile engine is subjected to stress, even though some very brilliant people put it together, it took a lot of intelligence. There's a lot of complicated things going on in your automobile engine. When it's subjected to stress, it doesn't evolve and adapt into a toaster or a washing machine. It just stops being an engine. It is, in a sense, fragile. It has two different states. It's either working or it's not working. It will not evolve and adapt. When we contrast ecosystems, we can look at complex and merely complicated, and we see and understand kind of right away the difference. If a rainforest over the course of a year receives too much rain or not enough sunlight, we would expect that the flora and the fauna would adapt and evolve and change and shift, but the system wouldn't collapse. It wouldn't cease to be rainforest. It would just be a rainforest of a different diversity, a different flavor. It has the ability to adapt and change and emerge new forms over time based on stress. When we look at a cornfield, even though a cornfield is a very complicated undertaking, let's not pretend that it's not. You have to have not only seed, but you have to have nutrients, you have to have water, you need pesticide, you need sun. We all understand that if we get too much rain in one season or too much sun in another season, the corn is not going to evolve into soybeans. It's just going to cease to be corn. It's just going to be bad corn. There's a binary set of outcomes to systems that are merely complicated. When we look at human habitat and the changes that we have made in modern times, we see the same kind of behavior. We see a complex adaptive system, one that, when subjected to stress, is able to evolve and adapt and respond. And we see another set of conditions that are merely complicated, that perform their task very, very well. They're able to do what we expect it to do very well, but we give up, as a result, that adaptability, that flexibility, that capacity to evolve and emerge new forms based on stress that we experience. Traditional patterns of development, like all complex adaptive systems, operate at a fractal level, at a very block level. When we look at the building blocks of this system, we see things like this as the very beginning. Every city in North America that was founded prior to the Great Depression began just like this. A series of little pop-up shacks, some poor people with some hopes and dreams about the future. Iowa City started just like this. We could go back in time and find a photo of somewhere of Iowa City in an emergent phase like this. Des Moines started like this. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Milwaukee, where we were the last 2 days, began just like this. Manhattan, at one point in its past, was a series of little pop-up shacks. This happens to be my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. I live a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is what it looked like back in 1870. We built thousands of places like this across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does the stock market crash? Does unemployment skyrocket? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out Wall Street? Of course not. We understand what these are. These are little bets. A few people lose a little bit of money. They salvage what they can. They move on to the next place. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. Think of a culture growing in a petri dish. You're looking at very similar types of patterns. As more and more people came to the place, more and more people began to congregate there, the underlying land value would increase, and that would create a natural redevelopment pressure where ultimately these little pop-up shacks would be torn down and replaced with buildings like this. This is the exact same street 30 years later. And over time, as more and more people came to this city, as more and more things started to happen, the underlying land values would continue to increase, creating more redevelopment pressure naturally. And after another 30 years of growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and becoming incrementally more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would become these buildings of brick and granite. This is that complex adaptive system at work. It is a system built on iteration, emerging new forms that themselves were adaptable and flexible over time. This is the way that humans have built their habitat for thousands and thousands of years around the world. We created a system now that is merely complicated. One that, while it takes very smart people to figure out and operate, it requires a lot of intellect and capacity to lay out all the things. It is designed not to adapt and be flexible, not to evolve and emerge new forms, but it's designed to do one thing and one thing over and over. When we look at that same street today, we see the results of this approach. This is the exact same street that I've been showing you, only today. It is a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And Strongtown started by looking at the financial impacts of our development pattern. If you want to grasp in one snapshot why cities struggle financially today, understand that the community has invested $500,000 in the public infrastructure in that little stretch of street. Where is the wealth that is going to sustain that investment generation after generation after generation? It's not there. It's simply not there. It's important for us to understand why our ancestors made this shift. Why did Americans decide to shift from this complex adaptive system to one that was merely complicated? And when I think about this and I look back, I try to be as generous as I can. I understand that today we are almost certainly screwing up many, many, many things for well-intentioned reasons that people who come after us are going to look back on us and say, what were those people thinking? I like to look back and try to, with the most generous lens possible, understand what people were thinking. When we look at the Great Depression, we have to acknowledge that at the time, people had no idea what caused it. Today, we still don't have agreement on what caused it. You can read economists from very different perspectives who will offer very coherent explanations for what caused the Great Depression, but they disagree with each other completely. We have no consensus around what actually caused it. More importantly, especially at the time, nobody knew how to get out of it. The entire New Deal project was an attempt to just try many different things to see if something would get it going again. The only thing that got us back to something near full employment, something where people actually had jobs and the economy was growing again, was World War II. When we took millions of working age people, shipped them off overseas to kill and die, and we took millions of other people and put them to work in industries building the implements of war: ships, tanks, airplanes, munitions. At some point towards the end of the war, it became clear that we were going to win, that the United States and its allies would be victorious. It was just a matter of when. And the economists, especially the economists advising the president, began to panic. Because the way they looked at the world is that we were going to now demobilize millions of working age people. We were going to shut down all these factories that had employed so many. What had changed about our economy? Nothing. What would stop us from just sliding right back into the depths of depression? And they were convinced that that was exactly what was going to happen at the end of World War II. Of course, that's not what happened. And we have the capacity of hindsight now to know that what they did was something very different. They created a brand new version of America. At the end of World War II, we were, in a sense, the last nation standing. We were the only nation who had not been decimated physically by war, the only major industrial power. We had all of this capacity. We had the world's reserve currency. We quite literally had all the gold. We had the world's most robust oil production. We had a nation united against common enemies who had lived through a decade of depression and another half decade of war. And this nation united looked and said, we are going to take all of this capacity and create a new prosperity for Americans. And that's what we did. That's what we set out to do. Part of what we were trying to solve here, and I think at the core of what we were trying to solve, is this age-old human tension. You can go back and read the Old Testament and you see this time and time again. How do you split one loaf of bread between two hungry people? This is something that humans have struggled with for all time. And these people set out to solve that problem. And the way they solved it was you create a second loaf. And then you create a third loaf and a fourth loaf and a fifth loaf. You grow. And the more you grow, the more abundance you will have. And the more abundance you will have, the more capacity you will have to go out and solve all of these thorny issues that have plagued humanity for so long. Here's the thing. It worked. It worked. You may not know this, but we're entering into a presidential election year. If you think back to the last presidential election we had two 70-year-old candidates who were, as part of their campaign rhetoric, giving us a vision consistent with the best time in their life, explaining to us how they would recreate those conditions for us today. And if you listen closely to their vision, you heard, on one hand, Ozzie and Harriet families and blue-collar jobs, and on the other hand, you heard a federal government that could be generous and expansive and do projects that were very similar to the Great Society and urban renewal. These were candidates who were essentially talking about the same exact period of time, this period of time we nostalgize today, the 2 decades immediately after World War II, when everything seemed possible. We created a kinetic growth machine, something merely complicated, to solve this set of problems that we faced. And it worked. It worked incredibly well. These are some maps we have from Fresno, California. We use Fresno as an example because we have great maps, but literally every city is going to have the same exact experience. Here's Fresno's growth prior to the Great Depression. Here's how the boundaries of the city grew up to the end of World War II. Now we kick in this kinetic growth machine and watch what happens to the boundaries of Fresno. If the objective is to create growth, and that growth as a mechanism to create the conditions where we can experience prosperity, this system does that. It creates that underlying growth. What is proved elusive is the corresponding prosperity. Yes, for a time, it looked like everything was possible. But as we have grown, and as we have shunned that difficult, painful feedback, that mechanism that forces us to stop and stall and rethink and adapt and change to new circumstances, what we've seen is that this machine has stopped serving us. We've got some great data from the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. At the end of World War II, Lafayette was a little over 33,000. Now it's around 120,000 people. That's a 3.5 times amount of growth. But when we look at something like their water system, what we see is at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water service to the people of Lafayette. Today, it's 10 times that. It's 50 feet of pipe per person. When we look at something like how they provide fire protection, we see at the end of World War II, it took about 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people to provide that level of fire protection. Today, it's 21 times that. It is taking more and more and more of our input to get declining levels of output in this system. Our cities, while they're growing very robustly and can be kind of induced to grow very robustly, take on all those long-term liabilities of servicing and maintaining all this area. We will fix all the pipes, we will fix all the pumps, the valves, the meters, the roads, the streets, the curb, the gutter. We'll provide police protection, fire protection, parks, libraries, in this expansive system. This might be okay. This might work. We maybe could increase our liabilities by 10x and 20x if our wealth was growing even more, if our families were becoming more prosperous, if our communities were actually becoming wealthier. But when we step back and we say, what's actually going on, what we see is that our people are actually not keeping up. We grow our liabilities 10 times and 20 times. We grow our wealth only 1.6 times. In Lafayette, we see what we see in cities all over the country. Families are saving less. They're being encumbered with more and more debt. They are growing, in a word, like our cities, like our economy, ever more fragile. This is not how things should be or things used to be. It's important for us to understand the long-term impacts of this shift we've made. This is a neighborhood in my hometown. I want you to focus on these 2 blocks right here. You'll see they're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure that serves them, essentially the same cost to the community. These lots used to all be developed the same way. They used to look like that picture there on the left. That block on the left and the 2 other blocks to the east of it were all built in the 1920s. As my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks. And so what you're looking at here is the pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. This would have been the cheapest building built by poor people out on the edge of town. And had things continued as they had for thousands of years, the expectation would be that ultimately As more and more people showed up, the land underneath would become more valuable. The properties would be redeveloped, reinvested. You would get second and third stories. They become more intense, more ornate. That's not what happened. These were built in the 20s. Then we had the Great Depression. We had World War II. And then we skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These 3 blocks have stagnated for almost a century now. 2 blocks over used to look just like this one. We got it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-thru, right? Norwegian Mexican food. In our kinetic growth model, this checked off every box we had. We got rid of blight. We got something new. It meets the zoning regulations. It's got the right amount of parking. It's got the right sign configuration. It meets the right floor area ratios. It meets all the objectives of the financing and the secondary market. The environmental people showed up and said, would you put native stormwater plants in the stormwater area, which they did. The bike walk people showed up and said, hey, would you put in a sidewalk, which they did. The sidewalk ends right there, but they got that stretch. So when we look at the things that we said are our values, the things we prioritize on that checklist, we met every single one. This is a home run of a project. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old blighted rundown block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the new Taco John's, it's the same size, the same area, the same amount of public expense ongoing to provide service and maintenance, yet the value there is only $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, this complex human habitat, the messy way we built cities for thousands and thousands of years. You're looking at it in its infant phase after 90 plus years of neglect. And it still outperforms, oh, how did I get here? It still outperforms by a wide, wide margin the stuff we're building brand new today. And we all know what's going to happen to that taco place, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new taco place up the road somewhere. This will be a used car lot. A decade later, it will be boarded up. We'll be trying to get some type of tax subsidy to get it torn down and redeveloped. We've all lived long enough and been around to see this kind of pattern. This is not an anomaly. This is something we see happen in city after city after city. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy runs a firm out of Asheville, North Carolina called Urban 3. Urban 3 does financial modeling for cities, and they've modeled thousands of cities all over the world, most of them in North America, including many, many, many here in Iowa. And what we see is a similar pattern emerge over and over. The areas that are part of this complex, messy human habitat dramatically outperform everything that we built subsequent. If you think of a cornfield, the parts of the cornfield that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. That's where we get the most bushels per acre. Where in the city do we get the most value per acre? Where's the most productive part of the city? This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is a great city, but it has suffered from decades and decades of decline and disinvestment, deindustrialization. Buffalo has experienced population loss every single year since the end of World War II, including last year. Yet if we step back and we say, where's the most productive land in Buffalo, New York? Can you point to where the traditional downtown is? Where that messy, complex human habitat is? Not only is it a massive repository of wealth, it absolutely dwarfs everything that has come subsequent. This is the same thing we see in city after city after city. Here's a smaller city in upstate New York, same kind of thing. My friend Joe sent me a bunch of photos to share with you just to make the point. Here's a city, Manchester, New Hampshire, same kind of pattern. Bozeman, Montana. Here's Brevard, North Carolina. Here's a little town by where I live. This is Crosby, Minnesota. When I first went to Crosby, they said, Chuck, we have some great stuff happening out here. We've got some great stuff happening out here, but these neighborhoods in here are really struggling. We've got to figure out how to get some of this stuff torn down and redeveloped. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. And all those poor neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. What we have come to understand is that we have created a complicated machine that grows very, very quickly. We can generate a lot of growth. And when you listen to economists today talk about how we get the economy growing, they almost always talk about investments in infrastructure. Investments in infrastructure are so simple because they create the conditions where we can experience growth today very easily. And if your obsession is growth in the next GDP, in the next quarter's GDP, or growth in the next 12 months, infrastructure is the easiest way to do it. We go out and we build a new interchange. We put in a new frontage road. We run sewer and water out to the edge. And we just get like pop-up growth. We all understand this. We all see this. This is not very difficult. Complicated, yes. It takes professionals to do. It takes professionals to execute. I get it. This growth can happen, and we can experience it next quarter and the next quarter and the next quarter if and only if our local communities are willing to take on enormous long-term liabilities. If we are willing to take on the insolvency that comes with this growth pattern, we can continue to experience new growth quarter after quarter after quarter. The problem is, after decades of doing this, we are swamped with liabilities. We do not have the capacity to maintain everything that we have built with the wealth that has been created by those investments. And so our challenge today is not how do we continue to grow in this pattern? How do we continue to do more of this? How do we continue to get the next big project or the next big thing? But our challenge is to actually go back and make better use of what we've already built. To, in a sense, thicken up this framework that we have created. The subtitle for our book is A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild Prosperity. And the reason we focus on the bottom up is because making better use of what we've already built is a hyper-local undertaking. It requires us to inject back in some of that complexity, some of that messiness, some of that feedback, so that we can start again to respond to the stresses that we are feeling daily, that we are incapacitated from actually dealing with today in our current framework. Let's talk about how we make this happen. There's a saying out of Silicon Valley about innovation that I really like and think is good for us to think about in this dialogue. It goes like this: innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb, while innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. If we ask people, people will tell you they have a preference for smart over dumb. But if you observe people, if you interact with people, you will see that we have an enormous preference for order over chaos. In an affluent society, we have very, very strong preferences for order over chaos. We will tolerate a ridiculous amount of dumb so that we don't have to experience any messiness. And if you doubt me, think of the last time you sat at a traffic signal at 1 a.m. We need to create these complex feedback loops again. We need to have the capacity to respond to stress as individuals, at the block level, at the neighborhood level, at the community level. And what that requires us to do, if we want the kind of smart innovation that is actually going to make our cities healthy and prosperous and successful, we need to be able to tolerate the little bit of innovation and messiness at the block level needed to bring that type of innovation about. That is a cultural shift. That is a shift that we all have to champion in our blocks in our neighborhoods. This is a map of Lafayette, Louisiana. And it looks a little bit like the other maps that I've shown you, but there's a fundamental difference in this one. This one is not a financial productivity map. This one you can think of more as a profit and loss map. We went out in Lafayette, Louisiana, and we looked at every expense that the city had. We mapped them all up. Here's your transit expense. Here's your road maintenance expense. Here's your fire department expense. We mapped them all up. Then we looked at every source of revenue that the city had. Here's where your property taxes come from. Here's where your sales taxes come from. Here's where your utility fees come from. And we mapped them up. And at the end, we mashed all these maps together into this profit and loss map. Everywhere where you see blue, you're seeing a property that annually pays more taxes and fees to the city than it requires in ongoing service and maintenance. Everywhere where you see red is the exact opposite. These are properties that are are receiving more in ongoing service and maintenance than they pay in taxes on an annual basis. This map looks very much like the other maps because it's very similar. Right in the middle here, you've got the core downtown. There's a crescent of blue that runs out here on the east. That crescent of blue are the poorest neighborhoods in the community. Here's what these look like. The top photo is the core downtown. The bottom is a sample shot from one of those core neighborhoods. And just so we're clear, our analysis assumes that the city is actually out there doing the work. So out there fixing the sidewalks, maintaining the filling the potholes, mowing the ditches. The fact that they're so clearly not in these neighborhoods just means that they're even more profitable than we're showing. These neighborhoods don't pass the eye test. They don't look successful. They don't look prosperous. But on paper, they're paying the freight. These poorer neighborhoods are subsidizing the wealthier neighborhoods. What's that red area? We all know at this point what that is, right? It's the mall, the big box stores, the strip malls, the franchise drive-through restaurants, the windy cul-de-sac streets, the 3-car garages with the attached house. All that stuff out there. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order for the city to make good on every promise they've made, in order for them to provide all the police and fire protection, maintain all the infrastructure, do everything they've said they would do, median taxes need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 a family makes will need to get sent back to the city just to maintain what they've already built. This won't happen. It can't possibly happen. And so at some point in the city of Lafayette, like many, many cities we see in North America, that backlog of maintenance, that backlog of things we said we'd do is going to turn into a list that we're not going to do. And we're going to have to make a decision at some point when the road falls apart. We're going to fix this road and not this road. We're going to fix this pipe and not this pipe. We're going to maintain this neighborhood and not this neighborhood. Does this sound like a city we're familiar with? Very much like Detroit. The bankruptcy happens slowly and then all at once. The most common question I get when I talk about this stuff, especially this Lafayette map, is explain why. Tell us why. And even more pointedly, I was at the U.S. Congress a couple weeks ago, and I met with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And what the people there wanted to know is not just why, but give us the 3 things we can legislate that would bring about this. And my answer is frustrating and disappointing to people who want an easy solution. It's complicated. It's really complex. It's spooky almost. I'm an engineer. I'm a planner. I've got tons of experience. I've got all the initials behind my name. I was number 10 on Plan Edison's list. My kids actually looked at that list. I picked them up from school and I showed it to my daughter. My kids like Hamilton. And Thomas Jefferson's on that list because, of course, he did the the Northwest Act of 1897 he authored. The whole section township range system is Jefferson's innovation. It's had more impact than us. And she looked at this list and she said, "Dad, something's wrong with this list." But you look and there is, for me, a spooky embedded wisdom in this system that I'm going to tell you standing up here in front of you today that I don't fully grasp. We have seen modeled thousands of cities around the world. Even when they have different configurations, the maps very much look the same. When we say, where's the most productive parts of the city, this is what we get. Let me give you a couple insights. And understand when I do this, I'm not giving you a roadmap for what to do. I'm pointing out to you the complexity of what's happening here. In some of these blue areas, some of the areas that look like this, we found places where the sewage would run from the home in a small pipe, flow into a larger pipe, down to a lift station, and be pumped out to their sewage treatment facility. We found homes in this red area where the sewage would run from the house in a little pipe into a larger pipe down to a lift station, and then be pumped through a series of 20 different pumps and lift stations and pipes in order to get to the same treatment facility. Both of those houses are considered one house, one account. They both pay the same amount. The city gets the same amount of revenue from each. But there's dramatically different costs to provide that service. There's one example. Let me give you a second example. There's a great book called Cognitive Architecture. I referred to it a couple times in my book. It was very influential on me. In that book, written by an architect and a psychologist, they introduced me to the word thigmotaxis. Thigmotaxis is a Greek word that means wall hugging. If you have read Jane Jacobs talks about humans as being wall-loving creatures. Christopher Alexander, in his book The Pattern Language, says humans will stick to the edge of a room, stick to the edge of walls. We have a tendency to do this. If you think about a mouse scurrying across a room, they will scurry along the edge of the room. A deer will stick to the edge of the field. If you look at microbes under a microscope, you'll see they have a random pattern of movement until you put a metal bar into the petri dish, and then this very spooky thing happens. They line up along the edge of it and start to go in the same direction. Darwin called evolution a conservative process. And by conservative, what he was saying is that evolution conserves winning strategies and passes them on. And so at some point in our ancient past, maybe even our primordial past, it was beneficial to humans to have a wall condition or an edge condition that they could stay up against. And so somewhere in your brainstem, in my brainstem, is something that is triggered, a feeling of safety and security and comfort when we are near a wall and not out exposed somewhere. Think of the feeling you have walking down a comfortable main street versus the feeling you have walking through a Walmart parking lot. That's something deep in part of your brainstem that has been passed on to you. Now look at these photos. What do you see in this rundown traditional downtown? You see an edge, you see walls. What do you see in this startup neighborhood down here on the bottom? This poor neighborhood. You see buildings that, while they don't form a wall, they line up. And you can imagine these humans assembling their habitat over time. What would we expect to see? We expect to see these gaps filled in as the thing evolves, that petri dish continues to expand, and ultimately what form would you get? You would get the very same pattern. This spooky wisdom is set up to not only make our cities financially successful, but also to actually deal with some of the tensions and anxieties, to comfort some of those things in us as humans. This is very spooky stuff. I'll give you a third example. Imagine you were moving to a city, you're a poor person, you're going to build a house, and you intuitively comprehend that the byproduct of your efforts is going to have to be sufficient, along with your neighbors, to, at the very minimum, sustain the street out in front of your house. And whether that means you all getting together with shovels and rakes to fix it, or paying your taxes to a government that would come in and do it on your behalf, you understand that this is going to be, at a minimum, a shared responsibility between you and your immediate neighbors. How do you build your house? Well, what you do is you make your house skinny and deep. And by making it skinny and deep, what happens is you share that responsibility now with many, many, many more homes. The burden of that is now shared amongst more people. Now pretend that instead of trying to meet many different competing objectives, to harmonize many different stresses, to deal with many different situations at once, you only are concerned with kinetic growth. How do we grow? How do we get the next thing? How do we continue to repeat this pattern over and over again? And that complex, messy, difficult feedback goes away. What happens to your home now? Well, now it's no longer skinny and deep, it just rotates. And now it's broad and shallow. This is how we go from 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person. We've lost that feedback loop that told us this doesn't work. This doesn't work. When we look at our development pattern, we see things like this. The apex species right now are big box stores. Here's a Kmart at $384,000 an acre, the Walmart at $967,000. When we shift to the core downtown, here's a representative, old warehouse that's now been converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all-time place, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million per acre. I have something I would like you to do some point in the next few days. I want you to go out to a neighborhood, get out of your car, and experience it by walking. And do this as a strong towns advocate. If you are out there and you have a paved street, it has curb and gutter, it has sidewalks, it has manhole covers and hydrants, you know that you've got a street that is costing you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a foot to build. So when you walk this street, I want you to count 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, 12,000. And I want you to look to the side and see what is actually there, what you're actually getting for that community investment. And what you are going to discover, and it's going to make you sick to your stomach, what you're going to discover is that our cities are nothing but gaps. Nothing but massive, massive gaps. It's actually grotesque, the level of waste that is just built into what we have created. I have 2 daughters. They're 15 and 12. And the big thing in their age cohort right now is to not use plastic straws. They're very excited about this. Dad, save the turtles, don't use a straw. I get it. They actually took the step and ordered metal straws. They came from Amazon wrapped in plastic. But now they have these metal straws and they carry them everywhere, and they're very proud of the fact that they're able to conserve and save. And as this prudent Norwegian, I'm encouraging it. It's very good. Be prudent. I think it's very helpful. But once you start to recognize the trillions and trillions of dollars and understand what I'm talking about, the energy of a continent, of a people, our passions, our desires, how much of that is wrapped up underground, on the surface of the ground, in our neighborhoods, in stuff that pays not only no return, but presents this eternal obligation to us as communities, this financial millstone around our necks, you will be sick to your stomach. Our cities are nothing but gaps. Now look at Jimmy's Pizza again. Jimmy's Pizza feels like it's beneath us. We are better than this. We don't aspire to Jimmy's Pizza. What is Jimmy's Pizza? That's the first step. That's what every poor person has built when they were starting out building a place. And guess what? We're poor people now too. when we look at all these gaps we have, that is where we actually start. If we can start to fill in some of these places with buildings like that, look at the wealth we can create. Look at the prosperity we can start to build. And who is Jimmy? Jimmy's not these people here. And by the way, I don't have a problem with these people. A lot of people want me to come and speak poorly of these kind of enterprises. I get it. But these people are merely responding to the kinetic growth machine we have set up. When we look at the way we have configured our zoning ordinances, building codes, approval permitting processes, our financing incentives, everything is designed to create more and more of this. They're simply filling the need we have expressed. Who is Jimmy? Jimmy is your neighbor. Jimmy goes to the same church that you go to. His kids go to the same school as your kids. Jimmy sponsors a local softball team. Jimmy has a float in your 4th of July parade. Jimmy banks at a local bank. He uses a local accountant. He advertises in your local newspaper. Jimmy is a part of your economic ecosystem. We have to consciously go out and build more places for Jimmy. We need more Jimmys. We do this with a couple of important shifts in our thinking. We have to create the conditions where we can, in a smart way, in a chaotic but smart bottom-up way, start to adapt to the stress that we are all experiencing in our communities. The first thing we do is we have to allow our neighborhoods to breathe again. We have to allow them to adapt. We have to allow them to evolve. And that means getting them out of being frozen, getting them out of being locked in amber, and allowing them to grow and shift to the next increment of intensity by right. There's a little bit of technical speak in that, so let me make sure I'm clear. What we're talking about is every neighborhood should have the capacity to grow to the next step beyond what it is with as little friction as possible. You should be able to go into City Hall at 9 a.m. in the morning with a completed permit, and you should be able to walk out by noon with approval to build whatever it is. If you live in a neighborhood of single-family homes, there should be no friction for you to build an accessory apartment or a duplex. There should be nothing that stops that. You shouldn't have to go grovel in front of boards and commissions. You shouldn't have to ask permission from your neighbors. We need our neighborhoods to be able to evolve and shift and change. That freaks us out. And it freaks us out because we're used to the current pattern of growth. We're used to this trade-off that we've made where we say, all of you, 90% of you, 95% of you, your neighborhoods we will protect. We will use zoning and regulation and other controls to keep you locked under glass, to keep you protected from all change. We're going to treat you as a complicated machine, but we're going to keep it running. We're not going to allow it to break, theoretically. We know what's coming. We're going to keep you locked under glass. But 5% of you are going to experience radical change. You're going to experience so much transformation that you're not even going to be recognizable a decade from now. This is not a healthy way to grow. It's not a viable long-term way to grow. It's not responding to feedback. And so at Strong Towns, we have a saying, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. We have to allow those complex adaptive systems to once again start to direct where investments are going in our communities. Along with this, we need to, with intention and purpose, lower the bar of entry. We have created, through all compassionate reasons, a very high bar to participating in our society today. If you want to participate in our society, you must be able to afford a 30-year mortgage. You must be able to have 2 automobiles. If you want to start a business, you must be able to put $250,000 of investment up front before you sell a single product. There are all these things that we have put as burdens to entry. And what happens is that a whole bunch of people are not allowed to participate fully in our society. Some of the most entrepreneurial people that we have are not given a place where they can start with nothing and end up with something. We have to intentionally go out and change that. Let me give you a couple examples of what I mean. This we call a tiny house. Our ancestors would have called this a house. Today we create all kinds of rules and special exemptions for tiny houses. If you want to build a house, very simple process. If you want to build a tiny house, oh my gosh, now you have to go in front of this board, you've got to go in front of this group, you've got to go grovel in front of your neighbors, you've got to demonstrate these 18 points of why you're not going to destroy the neighborhood and undermine the good moral fiber of the community. This is how humans built their homes for thousands of years. They started very small, very simple. As they saved a little bit of money, they would add on. As they saved a little bit more, they would maybe put a second story on. The neighbor needed help, you'd go help them. When you needed help, they would come and help you. This is how we built communities for thousands of years. Can't do it today. Can't do it. We need to allow this kind of thing to happen naturally. Here's another example. This is from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon is a deindustrialized city, has lost tens of thousands of people. They had a downtown that had lots and lots of vacancies. In order to get this going again, they recognized that their bar to entry was too high. The entrepreneurs in their community didn't have $200,000 to put in a brand new sprinkler system, tens of thousands of dollars to rework the bathrooms to be ADA compliant. They couldn't open up new businesses because they didn't have that capital. So what they said is, we're going to buy a bunch of storage sheds. They had a gap in their streetscape. Think back to our conversation on thigmotaxis. Whenever there's a gap in your streetscape, humans will generally stay away from crossing that gap. It becomes a barrier. And so they went out and they filled that gap with these storage sheds, closed up their streetscape, provided a more walkable place. And they rent these places very cheaply to startup entrepreneurs. Crazy people who have no concept that they can fail. And they let them try out their ideas. People are out here selling soap and honey and t-shirts, and they're trying to figure out what kind of business they can create that will be of service to other people in the community that they can make a living doing. Here's the amazing thing. Not only are all these full, and not only are there a huge waiting list to get in them, but guess what else is full? The core downtown is full. And a lot of the people that are now in the core downtown are people who got proof of concept here. They went in, they figured out how to run their business, how to sell their product, how to make it successful, and then they had the confidence and the capital to go downtown and make a bigger investment. If we don't allow people to start with nothing, we rob them of something important. We deny them the capacity to participate. And these are some of the most entrepreneurial people you will ever meet. We also have to shift the way we do our public investments. We are very comfortable today, and I say this as an engineer and as a planner who worked on these kind of projects for many, many years. We've developed systems right now that are very comfortable for us to deliver new investment. Our city governments generally orient themselves as if they are the lowest rung on a food chain. We look up this food chain. We say, what can we get from the federal government? What can we get from the state government? What can we borrow from the bond market? What capacity do we have to do that? And what developer can we get to come in with outside capital to make investments in our community? And we orient up because part of this kinetic growth machine is to bring in that additional resources to grow our community. We actually need to switch that around and stop looking at ourselves at the bottom of the food chain and look at us as cities as a collection of people working together to build a common, prosperous place. We need to start looking at where what we have built is not working for the people who actually live in our communities. At Strong Towns, we've created a 4-step process to make these kinds of high-returning investments. Step number 1, go out and humbly observe where people struggle. Go out and with humility, observe where people in the community are having a difficult time using what has been built for them. I stress humility because we have to go out with open minds. We can't go out with our own preconceived solution or preconceived idea of what is. We have to actually go out and quite literally walk a mile in people's shoes, walk with them and observe where they're having a difficult time living in the city as it has been built. Don't ask them. They'll tell you all kinds of crazy stuff. Observe. Step number 2, ask a very simple question. What is the next smallest thing that could be done right now to address that struggle? Not what is the ultimate solution for all time, not what is the thing that there's a federal grant program to do, not what is the big mega project we can bring in to fix this. What is the thing we can do with duct tape and paint, straw bales and cones to actually make this struggle a little bit less onerous? Step number 3, do that thing. Do that thing right now. Don't form a committee to study it. Don't take 6 months of deliberation. Don't bring in a consultant. Just go out with the resources you have and do that thing right now. Step 4, repeat that process again and again and again and again. This very pernicious notion has crept into local governments, and I experience this as I go around the country, where now we talk about the people who live in our communities, our citizens, our residents. We talk about them as customers. And the refrain we have at City Hall, and it's reflected often in business communities and others, how is our customer service? Are we customer friendly? Have we set up our systems to respond in a cheerful and friendly manner to people who walk in the door? This is the wrong way to view a community of people working together to build a strong town. Jane Jacobs talked about cities as co-creations of us all working together to build this place. When cities go out and when we can humbly observe where people struggle, and when we can respond quickly and iteratively to those struggles, what we do is we give people agency to co-create with us. We do something, they respond. We observe that, we respond. They respond to that, we respond. And all of a sudden, these complex feedback loops that we're trying to create that are so beneficial and important for us to making our places stronger and healthier and more prosperous can start to emerge again. We can continue down this path, this kinetic growth path, this complex kind of professional-led notion that we have the right idea, the right fad. We can go to the latest American Planning Association journal and see that successful cities are now building decorative lighting and blinged out crosswalks. And we can just go and do that and import prosperity. And we will find, as we've found for decades now, that prosperity is fleeting at best. Or we can humble ourselves to actually take a different look at our city, to get in touch not with what the next big program is or next initiative is, but where people actually struggle. And to take the resources that we have and do something about that with a sense of urgency. And if we do that, if we commit to that approach and that process, what we find is that not only are we going to be making the lowest cost, highest returning investments that we can possibly make, but our approach cannot help but improve people's lives. That is the essence of what it means to build a strong town. Thank you so much for coming out today, for being here, for taking part in this. I want to encourage you to join our conversation. We tell people if you are inspired by our work, the number one thing you can do for us is to share it with somebody else. Go tell someone else about what you've heard. Use your words to explain it to them. That's the most powerful way to do it. If you are very, very inspired in what we do, we have a very robust and active online community right now. People from across the country, across the world, are struggling with these issues, trying to figure out what we do next. We publish 2-3 articles a day about this. We have got all the online social media presence. We have discussion groups we formed and Slack channels in different places where you can go and meet people from all over who are wrestling with these problems and how to make it better. And I encourage you to learn from them and then add your expertise to that growing conversation. If you really, really, really are inspired by what we do, 40% of our budget comes from memberships, people who give us $5, $10 a month just to go out and share this message in more and more places. We promise you we will do that and continue to grow this movement and make our cultural conversation fertile for the kind of change that we all want to see happen. So thank you so much. If you look at Jimmy's was financial productivity. Financial productivity is actually third grade math. It's value per acre. So what you need is you need a common reference of value. The easiest one often is the assessor's data. Some places the assessor's data correlates with market data. Some places it's a little bit off. But the easiest database to get is that. Zillow also has databases of property values that kind of fluctuate more with market conditions. But you're basically looking at what is the value. And I think the important thing when you're doing comparisons of places is that you use the same source, right? Because what you're looking at is comparatively what's more productive. Underlying then, the denominator is simply acres. What's the size? And you can do square feet if you want. You can do acres, but what you're looking at is an area. So it's value per an area. And that is the way you do it, an apples to apples comparison across these areas. That's a really good question. I always joke when I'm asked questions like this. I come from central Minnesota, where we have a lot of diversity. We have Lutherans and Catholics. We have Norwegians, Finns, and Swedes. That being said, in the book I talk about this a couple times, that race obviously was an accelerator of these changes after World War II. And when we look at practices like redlining, which was quite literally taking the federal secondary market standards that were set up to facilitate mortgages and this kind of horizontal expansion and saying these neighborhoods here qualify for that type of funding, but these other neighborhoods here, we're going to kind of rob them of that capital, had a huge impact on the trajectory of people living in those places. I also think it's important to point out that when engineers and other people who were planning major infrastructure improvements, particularly in those 2 decades after World War II, we still see this today, but it was very, very pernicious back then. They would look at and ask, let's again be generous. They would ask very logical questions like, we want to build this highway, where are we going to build it? And they would say, well, let's build it through the neighborhood where we can acquire the property for the cheapest. And what neighborhood would that be? That would be the poorest neighborhood where the people were least organized to resist us. Because if we go to a wealthy neighborhood where they can hire lawyers and resist us, we're going to be tied up fighting for years. And so what happened is a lot of the poorest neighborhoods, at the same time they were being redlined and experiencing disinvestment, they were also being bisected by major infrastructure projects. They became the dumping grounds for the incinerators and the sewage treatment facilities and the 6-lane highways through the middle of their neighborhoods. That being said, I do think it's very important for us to go beyond like a simple white flight narrative. And I say that because not only can you look at a place like my town and see the same exact pattern as we see in places where race was a critical accelerating factor. You can go to Salt Lake City or Provo or a place where, it was like all white people. They had the same exact pattern of development. There's something fundamentally different that was the underlying driver, even where there were other things that were accelerants. And I make this point, I think it's very important to make, because what we're in the process of doing right now is actually takes what we did after World War II in terms of its perniciousness and despoticness and accelerates it. It just expands on it. After World War II, we decided that cities were no longer going to be the way they had been for years. For millennia, cities had been wealthy people surrounded by poor people. Think of the castle with serfs on the outside as like the crudest example of this. And this was, in a sense, again, a messy, tumultuous, chaotic, not well-structured system, but it balanced all these competing objectives. And the thing that you had if you were a poor person out on the edge is you had this sense that I could get started at very little, and if the city grew, my wealth would grow along with it. You had a chance to, in a sense, advance as the community advanced. There was something that tied you to the success of the place, the success of your neighbors. It wasn't egalitarian. I'm not pretending it was utopian. It was, there's a reason people walked away from this when they had a chance, because it forced us to deal with all these things at a very local level, but it provided that. At the end of World War II, we decided as Americans, cities were going to be poor people surrounded by wealthy people. And we spent trillions of dollars inverting that and making it happen. What we see today, as these systems of growth are no longer able to keep up with the liabilities, as all the things that have driven this are kind of waning in terms of the influence, as the tension and fragility grows, our cities are again starting to invert back to what I think is like a normal human habitat condition, which is the centers of cities are becoming places of investment. They're becoming homes where wealthier people are moving and living. They're becoming more exclusive. And the edges, again, are being inhabited by the poorest, most vulnerable people. Think about this for a second. When we abandon poor people in the center of our cities, when we rob those places of wealth and investment, it was despotic. And I think you can't really describe it any other way. But amidst that despotism, we abandoned people in neighborhoods that were still functionally coherent. You could still take a bus somewhere. You could still walk to a corner store. You could still find a place to work and eke out a living in this ecosystem. Today we are in the process, and we can see this in cities that have experienced accelerating rates of gentrification. We are in the process of abandoning poor people out on the edge in environments that are wholly hostile to them, in environments that were built with the assumption of infinite affluence. And so now you have people who are going to be living in neighborhoods where the closest grocery store is 5 miles away, across multiple lanes of nasty roadways, drainage ditches, fences, compounds. They're completely isolated from other people. This is not an environment conducive to human habitation unless you have massive amounts of affluence to overcome all the limitations. You can hire therapists and counselors and prescription drugs and everything else. And what we see is that in places where this is happening, this is a disaster. We need to find a way as we re-inhabit our core cities, and this is one of the reasons why I so emphasize the need for neighborhoods to be able to adapt and evolve, as opposed to stagnate with one place growing rapidly and then the next place growing rapidly and then the next place growing rapidly. That's just a recipe for dislocation. If we allow all our neighborhoods to evolve, to emerge, and to grow incrementally, what we do is we create the opportunity for the greatest number of people to share in that wealth creation. And we have the greatest chance to not repeat, I think, the worst mistakes of the immediate post-war decades. It's a great and very insightful question. I will say it like this. Historic preservation, as it exists in America today, is a very logical response to the insanity of our current development pattern. The idea that gorgeous, valuable buildings would be torn down to make way for parking lots, Taco John's, etc., is obscene. And I respect anyone who stands up and says, make that stop. I get it. I totally get it. We are, in my hometown, in the last dying days of tearing down a 1930s elementary school, a gorgeous brick building. It's going to take them tons of TNT to knock this thing down. We're tearing this down for 24 parking spaces. It makes me sick to my stomach. And I would join any historic preservationists who would chain themselves to this building to keep them from doing this. That being said, ultimately, we need to get to a point where historic preservation in its defensive, reactionary form is no longer necessary. That would be a world where not only are we keeping our existing buildings, but when we make improvements to them, they begin with that historic character and they build off of that. When we travel around the world and visit cities that we would consider as Americans deeply, deeply historic, what we see is that while they do have historic character and historic characteristics, and occasionally there is the building that they've kind of preserved in its like as close to pristine state as they can, no one in these cultures, and I spent a week in Paris this summer, would ever lock the city in amber. They expect the city to evolve and grow and change and shift. They just have internalized a character and a pattern. The example here in North America that I like to give is everyone likes to go to Charleston. If you've ever been to Charleston, you will see like a 12 block by 12 block area that is just absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's astounding how beautiful this is. And when you walk through it, you're just amazed. Like, this is gorgeous. And the gut reaction is, make this a historic preservation area. Never allow it to change. And I get that response. Like, I get that human response. But when I see the 12 block by 12 block by Charleston, what I see is an adolescent who's robbed of adulthood, who's been frozen, because Charleston should not be a 12 by 12 block area of 1-story and 2-story mansions that are out of reach for everybody. Charleston should be a 12 block by 12 block area of 6-story and 8-story colonial architecture of that style and era that is grand and beautiful, surrounded by 4 miles by 4 miles of what we see in the core of Charleston. In other words, it should be so much astounding beauty and greatness in one place that it absolutely overwhelms us. The historic preservationists would fight me on that. And I understand why, and I respect it. I think ultimately we need to get to a place where we're not destroying great buildings, and we're actually working to make more of that. Yes, that's a really good question. Small towns are a special case in our whole kinetic growth kind of Ponzi scheme conversation. And I want to make sure that this is understood, because it's the hardest part, really. What we have done post-World War II, and understand, I went through planning school and engineering school, and this is what we were taught. We look at every small town as just a mini version of a big city. Every small town, you look at that Des Moines, and Des Moines has a center city and then suburbs. And then we go to a small town and we say, well, look, they have a center city and suburbs. It's the same thing. And it's not. It's like completely different ecosystems. Because I think what will ultimately happen in a place like Des Moines, the merciless math is going to force Des Moines to one degree or another, Detroit, like, abandon a lot of the stuff out on the edge. And I don't know if it will happen like Detroit, where there's kind of a donut and then some gated communities around it, or whether it will be more outside in. I think there's many ways this can shake out. But if you look at small towns, there's no ecosystem like that. You can't lop off the hand and keep the body. It's all one body. It doesn't work that way. Small towns, let me say it like this, because I always hate to end on a downer. I feel like whatever urgency a big city has, a small town should have 100 times that urgency. 100 times that urgency. We have 854 cities in the state of Minnesota right now, municipal incorporated cities. I think in 2 decades, we will have fewer than 400. It might be fewer than 200. And it's simply because those places, not because they don't have demand for Jimmy's, because I hear what you're saying, but I don't think that's the case. And let me explain why. In my hometown, at the end of World War II, the population was 13,500 people. Today, the population is 13,500 people. It's 10 times the area. The neighborhood that I lived in back at the end of World War II had 13 grocery stores. Do you know how many it has today? 0. The grocery store there's one. It's out on the edge of town. Everybody goes to it. How did we have 13 grocery stores and the people working at the grocery stores and all? Well, because we had a Finnish grocery store, we had a Norwegian bakery, we had this butcher, we had that little, poultry place. We had all these different, we had this like ecosystem. When I have sat down and advised small towns and intimately talked with them, what I talk to them about is a strategy called import replacement. Right now, small towns are nothing but cash flow-throughs. And largely, if you look at the financial structure of small towns, we are getting government transfer payments in every small town. It's almost the leading source of capital. Social Security, other government transfer payments, that's the largest thing keeping them afloat. And the thing is, the systems have been set up, the dollar stores, the franchise restaurants, what have you, to just pump that capital out as quickly as possible. The amount of internal velocity is almost zero. And so what we need to do from an import replacement standpoint is say, how many of these things that we pay outsiders to do today can we start to do ourselves? I had one city back when I was a planner and doing consulting work that we started with haircuts. I'm like, okay, where do you get your haircut? I go to Grand Rapids, and Grand Rapids was 40 minutes away. Okay, so that's not very convenient. Nope, it's not at all. What do you do when you go get your haircut? Well, we take the whole family, we all get our haircuts, and while we're there, we go to the big box grocery store, we go to Target, we go to all the other places, we might even go to a movie and have a night out, and then we come home. That's our 1 day a month we go do this. I'm like, okay, cool. What if people could cut your hair here? Oh, we've tried that. There's not enough business here to support a haircut person. Okay, fine. What if there was enough business for one person 1 day a week? What do you mean? Who would ever cut hair 1 day a week? I'm like, let's go to Grand Rapids. Let's find one person who can do hair. Let's set them up, because a hair salon, my aunt used to cut hair. You got a chair, you've got a sink, you've got a scissors. It's not a very complex undertaking. Let's set up a place in City Hall. Let's bring the person in. Let's have a sign-up sheet. Everybody sign up. Monday is hair cutting day. And every Monday, someone will come in, we'll guarantee them 10 haircuts, and they can make that cash flow pay for them, and then you have one less reason to leave town. Well, Chuck, that's dumb. We're not going to be wealthy by doing haircuts. No. Do that again and again and again and again in everything that you leave town for. Now you're starting to do something. And when I look at small towns, I think we have to actually get that radical. Because what we have to do is we have to keep that flow of capital is so precious for us because it's so limited and they're so fragile, these places are, that we actually have to figure out every possible way we can to keep that capital here flowing around our communities. And that's going to require us to be very innovative. Small towns are ridiculously fragile. We are destroying them systematically. Our DOTs are destroying them. Our federal and state infrastructure programs are destroying them. As an engineer, I work for so many small towns doing multi-million-dollar projects where the annual budget was less than $100,000. How is that viable? I put in more sewer in one city than their entire tax base was worth. That's the wrong system for the wrong place. So we actually have to, if we care about small towns, get, I think, very radical back to the Jimmy's Pizza mindset. And I think that there's an urgency, a 10x urgency to do that kind of thing. I know I'm out of time. You're smiling. I'm going to go out in the hall, and if anyone wants me to sign a book, I'm more than happy to do that before we take off. Thank you.